The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 6th day of this 7-day session, and we are almost completely through this 6th day. Only have a few hours left. The session is going by rapidly, and if you feel that, that's a good sign. It means that things are unfolding in your practice, and you're really working at it. Of course, if you feel like it's dragging forever, then to really dive into that sense, and it will change. Today, I'd like to share again some of Kala Rinpoche's teachings. In this case, it's about death. In the Tibetan Buddhist practice, it's particularly emphasized that death can come at any time. We do not know when it can come, and it's urgent to prepare ourselves for it, not to fear it, not to try to deny it, which is what most of at least Western society does, but to explore what it could mean. What does happen? We're all going to die. There's no question about that. There's nobody yet that has been confirmed to live more than approximately 120 years in this world cycle. And it happens to everybody. It happens to everything. We die, everything dies, and then is renewed, reborn. But we have an incredible opportunity to check out how it is. There's a most excellent book that came out relatively recently by Mingyur Rinpoche, a Tibetan, young Tibetan teacher who comes from a family of Tibetan Rinpoches or spiritual teachers, in which he speaks of encountering all the places that he fears, including death. I'd highly advise reading it. It's an excellent book, and I've mentioned it before. In Love with the World, The Travels of a Buddhist Monk Through the Borders of Living and Dying. I think that's the title. When he was in his mid-30s, and he's not that much older now, he's in his 40s now, I believe, Mingyur Rinpoche, who had been quite almost suffocatingly cared for as he was growing up and as he was teaching as well. By this time, he'd been teaching for some time, had talked with his father before his father died, and his father was a deeply realized master, about the possibility of doing a solo pilgrimage, wandering about India, which is where he was living. And his father thought that was a great idea, spiritual pilgrimage. And so it took him many years before he was able to put into place what was necessary in order to make that happen, because he was essentially under such wrap and key that he couldn't just say, well, bye, see you later. It would not have been possible. He would have been required to take an attendant with him. He would have required to travel at some level of ease, and he would have been kept safe and so on and so forth. But what he wanted to do was cutting edge practice, in the words of Mitra-roshi. That is to go right up against anything he might fear, to explore it and to use it as a spiritual fertilizer. And so he managed to save some money. And this is a man who had never in his whole life had to buy a plane ticket or a train ticket or order a restaurant meal, or even was free to wander the streets of I don't know whether it was Dharamsala that he was living in, but at any rate, wherever he was living, he wasn't even free to wander without an attendant. And so he had to sneak out. And in order to sneak out, he had to find a way that he could unlock the gate that secured the area around where he was living. And he managed to do it through the pretense of having to buy a new lock and keeping the one of the keys for himself. So the time came. He called a taxi, which was a new experience for him, to take him to the train station. I think, actually, no, he wasn't living in Dharamsala. I think he was living in Bodhgaya, but I could be wrong. And it was somewhat anxiety producing. He was sort of hiding in the dark, waiting for this taxi to come and hoping not to be observed by anybody else, and started getting anxious already about whether the taxi was actually going to come, which is worth being, it is a possibility in India, believe me. All kinds of things are possible in India. Nothing is anything you can count on, really. And the taxi came and took him to the train station. He was headed to Varanasi, which is one of the sites that the Buddha frequented. And it took him several days before he got the courage to actually get on a train. He was accustomed to being in the air-conditioned first-class lounge in train stations, and now he was thrust among the ordinary folk who were literally sitting on the floor, and they didn't have the advantage of nice houses with indoor plumbing and so on and so forth. So they were sort of dirty and stinky and a little bit rough. And these were not the people he was accustomed to. So right there, he met a challenge in his life. But his determination was to use every single one of these encounters with something new and different, something strange, something disturbing, as a route of practice. And he had enough training, having been training in meditation practice since he was 6 years old, and going through intensive training in the monastic system of his sect of Tibetan Buddhism. India is not a place, as I said, that you can count on anything. I was there in 1996, early 1996, February 1996, along with Zui-san. Together we were attending a nearly month-long conference of Western Buddhist ordained women. And it was held in the Burmese Vihara. Both of us got quite ill with amoebic hepatitis, which was a very interesting experience. And we did receive medication and were cured. But we flew to Delhi, and it turns out that the place we were staying was not going to be possible anymore, because we were going to be in a Tibetan temple, but because suddenly a group of monks arrived, that was impossible for two women to stay there as well. So we ended up in a guest house. And then we were supposed to take a particular train, an overnight train to Gaia. And it turns out that reservations hadn't been made because the details somehow hadn't gotten to the people that needed to make the reservations. And the soonest they could make a reservation for a train was for 3 days later. And it wasn't the train that we had hoped to get on. So eventually we found ourselves at the train station at the seemingly appropriate time, only to discover that the train was not there and eventually disappeared from the notice board in the train station. We were told that it would be coming much later in the day and that we were to just go back to the guest house. So we did. We went back to the guest house and waited and came early, which was a good thing because the train arrived early. And still we had to wait. And it was quite chaotic getting onto the train. And then we were in this train, this sort of bunkhouse, basically, car, which was filled with Indian men, all of whom snored. It was quite a cacophony all night long. And that's fine. It was an adventure for us. And then we got up and I began to wonder, in Japan, everything goes precisely upon schedule. The man who is standing on the station platform ready to wave the train on is standing there looking at his watch, holding a flag, and at the precise second that it got to the moment that the train should leave, down went the flag and off took the train. And before every station, there was a readout in the first class trains and an announcement also. And in all other trains, there was simply an announcement of what station was coming next. And even they told you which side of the train car you would be getting off of, because you could get off either side depending on where the station platform was. And they would just let you know ahead of time all the details. Of course, in India, none of that happened. And we began to wonder, because through the very dirty windows, we could discern sometimes that the train just flew through stations. Other times it slowed down enough that people could jump on and jump off. And other times it actually stopped. And there was never an announcement as to where we were or what was happening. So we consulted the map that Zuisan's father had kindly provided us and recognized when we crossed a great wide river, approximately where we were, but we still didn't know which train station was the one we needed to get off. They didn't say the upcoming train station is Gaia. So we asked a man, another passenger, if he could tell us when Gaia was approaching. And he did indicate at a certain point that the station was coming up. And so we went out onto the back platform in case we would have to jump off. And he followed us. We were dressed in robes. And he said, "Are you Buddhist?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, just as we were about to jump off the train, "My name is Siddhartha," which is, of course, the name the Buddha was given when he was born, according to legend, at least. And it was an interesting time, those 3.5 weeks. Arriving 3 days later for the conference, we were right on time, it turns out, because nobody else could hardly get there in time. And in addition, had we arrived when we had planned to arrive, 2 Westerners were murdered in that tiny town that night. And of course, it could have been us. Death was everywhere. Very soon, it turned out that one of the women, a French woman, who had been on her way to come, had been riding in a rickshaw in Delhi, and it was hit by an enormous truck. And she was so severely injured, she was not expected to live. So several women who knew her personally traveled back and forth to Delhi to be with her in the hospital, because in those places in the world, your family really had to be with you in the hospital, because you weren't necessarily taken care of otherwise. You were sort of left in a room, if there was a room, and if there wasn't, then you were dealt with some other way. But in order to eat, your family had to provide you with food. This is how it is in those countries. And we experienced it personally in Burma, when my then 3-year-old ended up with a resistant ear infection. We only had access to one drug, and that was tetracycline. And he ended up with an ear infection that was resistant to tetracycline, and it was getting worse, and it went into his mastoid bone behind his ear. And of course, we couldn't fly him anywhere under those conditions, because the change in altitude and pressure would have most likely made the infection worse. And we were told to go ahead and have the surgery done in Mandalay. Well, the hospital in Mandalay was one that was known as a place you only went to die, because people were so afraid of it that by the time they got there, that was the condition they were in. We were in what was called the, it's kind of hard to conceive of this, but it was called the private ward. It was a big room. There were 2 rooms that were the private wards, and the beds were separated by what used to be looking like a movable blackboard in the old days in schools. And the beds, such as they were not anything like a hospital bed. They were just a narrow, high kind of platform that was populated by bed bugs. There were 2 toilets, squat toilets, but they were filled with excrement and not working. That was our hospital stay in Mandalay, and that was the first class version. So this kind of experience is not something that Mingyur Rinpoche was accustomed to. And he indeed wanted to test his spiritual development and deepen it by encountering these situations. He finally ran out of money. He did get to Varanasi. It took him 3 days before he got the courage to get on the train, and he never did sleep on the floor of the station like the other folks. He paid a small amount of money to go upstairs and sleep in a big room with other people on cots, which was preferable than to going as the locals did, who had no money. And for a while, a few weeks in Varanasi, he was able to buy food at a restaurant. And he did buy himself an outfit that is typical of pilgrims wearing, spiritual pilgrims. And he had a backpack, and he stuffed his Tibetan robes in it, so that he appeared simply as an itinerant pilgrim. and discovered that the restaurant where he'd enjoyed being served until he ran out of money wouldn't let him come in the front door anymore. He had to go around to the back at the end of the workday, at the end of the hours of open for the restaurant, and beg for his food. And if they had something, they'd give it to him. And after a few days, he got severely ill with diarrhea and vomiting. He was doing zazen in a park, and I think it was the park where the Buddha had died, actually, or the place where the Buddha had died, which was eventually made into a park. And he just became more and more and more ill until he literally was too weak to make it over to the water spigot to even get water. And somebody, while he was unconscious, had laid a couple of bottles of water next to him, but he went through those as well, and finally had no strength to do anything. And he could tell that he was dying, because the Tibetan Buddhists do training in the process of dying. And he could tell each of the stages that he was going through, physically and spiritually, and reached a point where he was very close to letting go completely. He opened to that experience willingly, recognized that he was sad, and actually started to cry because he realized he would never see his mother again. And then he woke up in a hospital. And that's how come we know this story. As somebody had seen him, recognized him, because he had taught this other man how to do zazen upon the other man's request. And so that man rescued him, paid for his time in the hospital, because you have to pay up front in hospitals in India often, usually. And it saved his life. And he continued on for another 4 or 5 years, wandering through India, getting sick again here and there. It's kind of hard to go through India without getting sick, to be honest. And when he emerged, when he returned to his monastery, he was a very different person. You could tell that by the videos that one can find on YouTube, on his channel, how he had so let go, so dedicated to just entering completely into the physical experience, the curiosity of what was going on, that it's very clear that he had deeper insights, deeper awakening experiences as a result. And that is open to us as well. On the cushion, we die tiny bit to who we think we are, who we assume we are, if we're doing the practice correctly. And of course, that's what makes it challenging, because we have so many attachments to everything, to our appearance, to our situation, to our environment, to our whole life. And yet, one day, all of this must be let go of. When Mitra-roshi was close to death, he wrote his last poem. It was, "As for liberating all sentient beings, just this left to do, letting go everything in the whole universe." When Mitra-roshi died, he was attended by a physician who specialized in end-of-life care. And the physician later wrote a book. And in it, he spoke of the amazing experience of being present at Roshi Kapleau's death, because he simply let go. There was no fight, there was no anxiety, there was no concern. He simply moved on. Deeply peaceful, no problem. And for people who have done deep meditation practice and reached an understanding, a profound understanding, it is possible like that. Other people who don't have that level of spiritual practice depth often will find themselves in pain and anxiety as they die. And of course, it depends on what we're taught as well. And I'd like to share a little bit, again, from Kala Rinpoche, again, from this book, Luminous Mind, The Way of the Buddha. This is on the urgency of practice. All phenomena are impermanent. Our body, too, is the result of a collection of different elements, good and bad, karma, the father's semen and the mother's egg, the elements, and of course, the primary consciousness. All beings in the universe are mortal. Those of the past have died. Those of the present and future will also die. Year by year, day by day, hour by hour, moment by moment, we will all move closer to the moment of our death. And no matter how brave or strong we are, we cannot deter it. No matter how fast we run, we cannot flee from death. However vast our learning, our keen erudition changes nothing. Not the heroism of an army, the influence of a powerful, of the powerful, the best trained troops, nor the ruses of clever people. Nothing can stop death, just as nothing can keep the sun from sinking and disappearing behind the mountains. No one knows how long he or she will live. Some die when they're still in the womb, others at birth or before. They can even stand on their own two legs. Some die in youth, others in old age. We also have no idea what the cause of our death will be. No one knows whether it will be by fire, water, wind, lightning, falling off a cliff, an avalanche or landslide, the collapse of a house, an army, poison, or a sudden attack, or an illness, or simply dying, as at least two of my family members have done. How fragile we are, like a candle in the wind, a bubble, or a dewdrop on a blade of grass. When death comes, even though we don't want it, we have to let go of all desire and abandon absolutely everything: land, house, wealth, parents, children, family, spouse, leaving even our body. We go alone to this fearsome place, which is the bardo. That is everyone's lot sooner or later. When we see someone die, hear of someone's death, or think about it, it should serve as a reminder that we too will definitely die. As long as we are strong, radiant, and happy, we don't think about it. But when a terminal illness descends upon us, we lose all strength. Our color fades, we take on the peaked aspect of a corpse, and we become unhappy. Then, when all the medicine, treatments, and rites turn out to be ineffective, and nothing else can stave off the torments of disease, we know we will die. Many years ago, there was a neighbor down the road who was dying. Interesting consequence of pesticides, actually. She had grown up in Oak Park, Illinois, which is a wealthy suburb of Chicago, in an era when the beautiful, stately elm trees were dying everywhere in the United States of Dutch elm disease. And so the city, in a valiant effort to keep them alive, was going around and spraying them every few days. And she and her siblings used to run after the truck and get immersed in the spray because it was cooling. It was before a lot of people had air conditioning, and that part of the country gets blistering, sticky hot in summer. My piano teacher when I was in high school lived in Oak Park. Anyway, the result was the pesticide began to deteriorate her brain. She was in her late 40s and nobody could figure out what the heck was going on with her because things were failing in bizarre ways. She told me that one day she looked at the computer screen in the office she was working on, and everything was green. It wasn't the screen, it was her eyesight. And finally, at the Mayo Clinic, they were able to decipher what was going on and attributed it to the pesticides. She was experiencing Parkinsonism, which is not Parkinson's, but it mimics Parkinson's, and was getting gradually more and more hard to move. In fact, we had to move her towards the end, and because the hospice situation in this part of the country offers only 20 hours a week of care, and she needed more than that. We went in, we took turns. There were three of us here at the temple that were women at the time, and we took turns going down and taking care of her, which largely meant getting her ready for bed and so on. And she asked me a couple of different times about death and dying. One question, and before I could open my mouth, she changed the subject. She clearly didn't want to hear about it. She went to bed, and we had to set her up with it was a tape machine that could do loops so that it could go on forever. And she would go to sleep listening to a talking book. Even going to sleep in silence was too frightening for her. And as time went on, we took care of her for about 5 months, and she kept going downhill. Shannon was the last of us to see her alive, and recognized as she was helping her go to bed that she suddenly realized she was going to die. And she did die later that night as the paralysis reached her heart. It was sad because she had 5 months in which to open to the possibility that maybe there was something not painful, not frightening. Maybe dying was not what she expected. Ramana Maharshi is a very famous sort of contemporary Indian sage. And when he was 14 years old, he had a great sudden attack of fear of dying. He thought about it and he couldn't see any reason for it. None of his family was in danger of dying at that moment, beyond the normal danger all of us are in. Nobody was sick. Nobody was clearly towards the end of life. And so he did something unique. He tuned in, just as Mingyur Rinpoche did. He tuned in and he imagined himself. He actually laid down on the floor in the room he was in and imagined himself no longer able to breathe, his body becoming stiff. Imagine himself dead now and being carried to the burning grounds. And he had a profoundly deep awakening experience. Profoundly deep. It changed his life radically. And he sat in samadhi, deep samadhi, for months, and eventually ended up, people gathered around him, simply drawn by his demeanor, his deep compassion. He was known for profound compassion, and eventually a sort of a temple grew up around him, and he lived. I don't remember how old he was, but he died of cancer, and he died deeply, profoundly, peacefully. He simply stopped breathing. Before that, his devotees gathered around him and were singing a song about the mountain that he lived on. And it clearly was a joyful experience for him to hear those sounds. One little tear fell out of an eye, and then he simply stopped breathing. What did he know that our neighbor didn't know? What did my brother know that our neighbor didn't know? What did they know that the elderly Italian Catholic ladies dying in Rochester, clutching their crucifixes in terror, didn't know? What is it that we don't know? Socrates apparently said, as he was dying of poison, because he was condemned to death and was forced to drink hemlock to die. And as it was happening and his legs were growing cold and the poison was creeping up, and his students were weeping around him, he says, "Why are you weeping? For all any of us knows, death could be the most amazing, beautiful experience." It depends on where we're at, mind-wise, practice-wise, when that moment comes. If we have gone deeply into our practice, we can recognize the nature of life and death as being nothing to fear, but an ongoing unfolding of our life karma. And it also should inspire us to live in the very best way possible, most compassionate, let go, kindly way possible, because karma is developed in everything we do. And the more positive karma we can have built up, that will follow us into the next life or lives. Kalar Rinpoche had also written, or said actually, he spoke in an earlier chapter called Mind After Death. If I say there is a self, you will think it's permanent. If I say there isn't a self, You will think that at death it disappears completely. And that was an ancient master saying. One life or many lives. All spiritual and religious traditions agree on some type of existence beyond this life, and all of them prepare us for that future. If after death there was nothing, if our existence were limited to this lifetime, we could be satisfied with worldly knowledge and activities. A spiritual practice, no matter what it is, would be unnecessary. The idea that death is a complete end, followed by sheer nothingness, is the product of an extremely narrow mind. It is as if someone who lives in France were to conclude that beyond the country's borders, the human species ceased to exist. While religions might be in general in agreement about the existence of an afterlife, the various traditions do have distinct perspectives about the nature of that afterlife. Some teach that death is not followed by more lifetimes, but by one eternal life, while Dharma teaches that death is followed by many lifetimes until enlightenment. And when it says until enlightenment, that means complete and full enlightenment. That doesn't mean until a Kensho or two, or 19, as Hakuin had. On the surface, those views might appear to be contrary, but they actually aren't. It's really just a question of presentation. Let's say that you're in France and you ask someone what Switzerland is like. And the person replies that Switzerland's a nice place. That response may be accurate, but it's quite general. Another person might give the same positive response, but add a more detailed description, explaining what it is that gives each area and each city its charm. This detailed description does not invalidate the first person's response in the least. Likewise, Christianity, for example, offers a general presentation of the afterlife, teaching that there is life after death and that the conditions of that life depend upon the way in which you live your present life. For a Christian, virtue leads to heaven and sinfulness leads to hell. That's the basic idea. Dharma, on the other hand, teaches the possibility of many future lives, that negative actions in this life lead to suffering in future lives, while positive actions lead to happy future lives, and finally to enlightenment. These two traditions are in perfect agreement about the need to abandon the negative or harmful and adopt the positive. They also agree on the results of negative or positive actions. There's no contradiction between them. The difference is that Christianity offers a brief presentation, while Buddhism offers a more detailed one. Space is beyond time. We can't say that space began to exist at a given point in time, or that it will cease to exist after a certain amount of time has passed. Similarly, the mind's emptiness is beyond time. Mind is essentially atemporal. By nature, mind is eternal beyond birth and death. These exist only at the level of the mind's illusions. When the mind does not know its nature and is therefore caught up in the path of illusions, it transmigrates endlessly in illusion from life to life. Conditioned by ignorance and karma, we have had to live out innumerable previous lives. In the future, we will be forced to live out many more. The mind transmigrates from life to life, from one illusion to the next, as long as it has not attained enlightenment, the awakening of a Buddha or great Bodhisattva. But through our practice, we can begin to recognize the nature of mind. And we shared in the last teisho yesterday more about that. I'd like to add one more thing here. This is from, again, You Are the Eyes of the World. And that is an amazingly perceptive title. We are each the eyes of our world. And what we see depends on our experiences and our assumptions around those experiences, our conditioning, our history. What is the reality? This is what we're seeking on the cushion. What is the profound reality? This is, by the way, Longchenpa. Is it Longchenpa? Relax the mind in that naked state of presence, which exists when you are not caught up in whatever objects may appear. Then there arises, without any intellectual elaboration, an ongoing lucidity, which is not caught up in any appearances or concepts. This is the deep experience of creativity, the primordial freedom of mind itself. So these are the instructions for coming to awakening, really. Relax the mind in that naked state of presence, which exists when you are not caught up in whatever objects may appear. Not caught up in whatever objects they appear. Doing our extended out breath, it lets us reach through a place of curiosity, an awareness of what's going through the mind. Thoughts come up. And when we choose to just experience their presence as if they were the clouds in the sky, this is the mind state this is talking about. This is what Bankei was talking about when he said, when you come to hear me talk and a dog barks, you haven't calculated that you're going to hear a dog bark, but it does. And immediately you understand it's a dog barking. Immediately you hear, woof. When we can reach that openness of mind, then what Longchenpa is saying can unfold. Relax the mind in that naked state of presence which exists when you are not caught up in whatever objects may appear. Then there arises, without any intellectual elaboration, an ongoing lucidity which is not caught up in any appearances or concepts. This is the deep experience of creativity, the primordial freedom of mind itself. The primordial freedom of mind itself. Understanding that deeply enough and experiencing it erases any fear of dying. But living this life is not necessarily all about preparing for dying. It's about living increasingly freely in such a way that our innate compassion and wisdom can function fully without obstruction, so that we can move in everything we do or say or think to express an openness, a clarity, a compassion, a wisdom that can hopefully inspire people, and also to respond to people. Mingyur Rinpoche, when he was sitting in that park, a man came to him who was trying to do zazen and didn't know how to do it, was struggling with it. And Rinpoche was still wearing his monk robes. The man, who he described as an Asian, came to him and said, are you a monk? And he said, yes. He said, will you teach me how to meditate? And Mingyur Rinpoche did. And that was the man who later on rescued him, came upon him in such dire straits, dying, and managed to get him to a hospital and pay for the treatment. And not only that, he tucked some money into Rinpoche's backpack so that he would be able to eat in a restaurant for at least a little bit of time so he could regain his strength. We don't have to calculate these things. The more let go we are, the more we naturally understand the way to move in each circumstance. And it naturally comes forth out of our innate compassion and wisdom. And this is a tremendous gift to all of life. And isn't that why we're all here? I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows. I apologize for going on for so long, but hopefully it will inspire you to dive deeper than you have gone before, because you will find it's incredibly worth it.